Listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Orinoco Tribune has a piece entitled "The United States of America's Coercive Diplomacy and Its Harm." The United States is used to accusing other countries of using great power status, coercive politics, and economic coercion to coerce other countries to obey and engage in coercive diplomacy. But in fact, the U.S. is the instigator of such diplomacy. For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston, one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled Revolting Capital, Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
The article continues: the invention rights, patent rights, and intellectual property rights of coercive diplomacy all belong to the U.S. For a long time, the U.S. will do everything possible to coerce other countries, and the U.S. has a very disgraceful, dark history in coercive diplomacy. Dr. Horne, please square that statement from the Orinoco Tribune with Biden's own words that he considers strengthening democracy as the defining challenge of our age. Today, we can say with pride that the democracies of the world are getting stronger, not weaker. Autocracies of the world are getting weaker, not stronger. That's a direct result of all of us coming together with confidence in ourselves and conviction in our cause. Those are quotes from Joe Biden. Can you square that circle for me, Dr. Gerald Horne?
Well, I'm afraid to say that, unfortunately, quite frankly, you cannot ascribe this lunacy on the part of Mr. Biden to an advanced state of Alzheimer's or dementia, which he has been accused of possessing. I think that even if he were 40 years younger and of sounder mind, he would be spewing forth such nonsense. But I think it's also important to point out that Mr. Biden has painted himself into a corner by waging war in Ukraine at the same time threatening war in China. Indeed, the latest scuttlebutt is that the United States may be encouraging and enticing a declaration of independence by the rebel island of Taiwan, which China claims as its own. And as a result of the January coming election, either their puppet wins, in which case they will encourage independence in order to provoke China, or their puppet loses, in that case they'll do the same thing. And the idea is that with every passing day, the United States is losing altitude with regard to its challenge to China. And so the issue then becomes, how do you leverage what the United States sees as an advantage, speaking of its $842 billion Pentagon budget, in order to bludgeon China into submission? But that kind of fantasy, I'm afraid to say, as noted, is not a result of a demented, or I should say diseased mind. It's a result of a cold-hearted calculation by the U.S. ruling class, which of course is united in a bipartisan fashion with regard to doing something concerning the People's Republic of China. But I would caution the hotheads in Washington that they're playing with fire, because, as you know, the new term of art in terms of describing relations between Beijing and Washington is de-risking. At first it was decoupling, but obviously that was somewhat ludicrous, since if you look at the bottom line of Tesla and Microsoft and Apple and KFC and Starbucks, decoupling, at least in the short term, is a fool's errand. So now they've adopted the term introduced and popularized by European Union Commission President Ursula von der Leyen of de-risking. But that saw cuts in both directions, because if you look at your papers this morning, you'll see that China is cutting purchases from Micron, which is a major U.S. technology firm, and that will hit Micron where it hurts. On the bottom line, it'll probably lead to lesser bonuses for its executives, not to mention layoffs for its workers. So that, I'm afraid to say, may even enhance this notion that has been floated that Washington sees military confrontation with China as something that should come sooner rather than later.
What's interesting about this article, the United States of America's Coercive Diplomacy and its Harm, is by Ministry of Foreign Affairs, People's Republic of China, that in fact it actually came from China. And at a time when China seems to be pushing back, we see Taiwan, the conversation is getting louder in Taiwan about the potential fallout. I use that word guardedly, of being the battlefield between China and the United States. At any rate, your thoughts?
Well, first of all, back to this term coercive diplomacy. I first recall being introduced to that term in the aftermath of Mozambican independence in 1975. Recall that Mozambique came to independence after a bloody war against U.S.-backed Portuguese colonialism. And it was led by left-wing forces, led by Samora Machel, the then left-leaning president and head of the ruling party, Frelimo. He was killed mysteriously in an airplane crash, something that I'm afraid to say befalls all too many real or imagined antagonists of Washington. And at that same time, you saw that Washington began to fund a religious insurgency in the north of the country, more pointedly in northern Mozambique, where there is a substantial Muslim population. And as a result, you see that these religious zealots have claimed quite a bit of territory. Interestingly enough, they have fundamentally wrecked an operation by Total, the French energy giant, which had been engaged in very lucrative bilateral ties with Mozambique. And at the same time, you see that Mozambique has had to call upon its African neighbors, which has then in turn drained them and made them more susceptible to the blandishments and outrages of U.S. imperialism. So coercive diplomacy is a real thing. However, once again, I would like to warn these hotheads and lunatics in Washington that this can cut in both directions. And in light of the fact that the vaunted G7 now has a GDP, a gross domestic product, that is less than that of their major competitors, speaking of the Chinese-led BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, with Iran and other nations lining up to join, that what they need to be worried about is that the tables will be turned and that the kinds of tactics that Washington has used so promiscuously against smaller nations like Mozambique can be turned on the G7 themselves.
Speaking of the G7, U.S. News reports Russia calls G7 summit incubator for anti-Russian and anti-Chinese hysteria. Russia's foreign ministry yesterday dismissed the G7 summit in Japan's Hiroshima as a politicized event that it said had pumped out anti-Russian and anti-Chinese statements and accused the forum of undermining global security. Your thoughts, Dr. Gerald Horne?
Well, if you think about it for more than a nanosecond, this G7 summit in Hiroshima, Japan, was quite chilling, meeting 700 miles from Chinese territory in a land, in a city that has become synonymous with atomic warfare, perpetrated by the United States of America, whose president, Joseph Biden, has been compared to Harry S. Truman, the man who pulled the trigger in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, leading to the instantaneous murder of tens of thousands and the subsequent killing of many other thousands. And so when they issue this communique that is dripping with threats against China, dripping with threats against Russia, it's quite unfortunate and quite chilling. And what's even more remarkable, perhaps, is that you have nations like Canada who are going against the interests of their people and their working class in the first instance by signing on to this. What they should be doing is warning Washington and U.S. imperialism that this two-front conflict with Russia on the Atlantic side and China on the Pacific side is nothing short of danger and peril, and that instead they should be pursuing a policy of peaceful coexistence. But alas, that's probably too much to ask.
Pepe Escobar has a new article, U.S. Empire of Debt Headed for Collapse, and he's talking about Professor Michael Hudson's new book, The Collapse of Antiquity, Greece and Rome as Civilization's Oligarchic Turning Point. Your thoughts?
Well, I read that article, and I'm also quite aware and quite cognizant of the debate that's taking place in Washington as we speak, with the MAGA Republicans trying to hold the economy hostage and, in fact, hold poor people hostage. Because what they're saying is that unless programs like food stamps are slashed dramatically, then they are willing to push not only poor people in wheelchairs off a cliff, but push the United States, perhaps the entire capitalist economy, over a cliff. This is reflective of the fact that, unfortunately, in the United States, we do not have a sufficiently strong and vibrant left-wing movement. And as ever, the ultimate loser in this conflict will be the poor and the working class. There is a distinct possibility, mark my words, that unless some sort of clarity and some sort of good sense is forced into the heads of the MAGA Republicans, you will face the possibility of senior citizens missing their Social Security checks within a few days, perhaps a few weeks, perhaps a few months, and you will have the spectacle of people in what is thought to be the richest country on planet Earth reduced to eating cat food. And this is a direct result of a debate over the budget, a debate over debt, which Pepe Escobar sketches so expertly in his typically astute style.
In the 2 minutes we have left, just expound a little bit on this so-called crisis. How much of it do you believe to be basically manufactured, and how willing are the Democrats to go along with this manufactured crisis?
Well, I think the hidden agenda with regard to this crisis is that if the United States defaults, the question is, what will that mean in terms of paying interest payments to the People's Bank in Beijing? Perhaps the United States will turn to the biggest deadbeat of all. Perhaps they will stiff Beijing. Perhaps they feel that this is part of the overall anti-China strategy, which, as noted, has a bipartisan character. Sadly, the mainstream, the corporate press, has not played up that issue. And also, I'm afraid to say the mainstream press has not played up the issue as well, that the Democrats are compromised. It's not a party, despite what you may have read, of the working class. It's not a party of unions. It's a party that fundamentally is dominated by finance capital, whereas the Republicans are dominated by virtually every wing of capital. So this is the problem. As long as there is not an independent voice of the poor, an independent voice of the working class, an independent voice of Black America that injects itself frontally and confrontationally into this debate, I'm afraid to say that instead of being at the table, we'll be on the menu.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.